Hey guys, this is episode number 47 of the Future Thinkers podcast. Today we're interviewing Jordan Greenhall, who's a serial entrepreneur, technologist, and complex systems thinker. He's also the CEO of Neurohacker Collective. In this two-part episode, we're going to talk about whether we're going into a global phase shift or a collapse. We're also going to talk about the concept of sense-making and collective intelligence. If you liked our episode with Daniel Schmachtenberger, you'll probably like this one too because they're actually partners in Neurohacker. To get the show notes, books, mentions, etc. from this episode, you can go to futurethinkers.org/47. We've mentioned Qualia a few times in previous episodes. It's a smart drug stack from Neurohacker Collective, which has been getting increasingly popular in the recent year. If you'd like to try it for yourself, you can go to futurethinkers.org/brainhack, all one word, and use the code FUTURE to get 10% off your purchase.
So we've been really busy in the last couple months. We're working on a new blockchain project of our own, actually, called Syndicate. It's a platform for crypto investors for evaluating, growing, and co-investing in ICOs and seed-stage blockchain startups. This year, there have been many ICOs, and if you're an investor, it can be difficult to keep up and know which ones are worth your time and investment. So Syndicate is meant to solve that problem by finding and screening out the best projects. The platform will have three types of users: the investors, the blockchain startups, and the service providers in the blockchain space like developers, legal professionals, researchers, and PR and media people. The idea is to bring everyone together to help increase the success rate of ICOs and their ROI for everyone involved. If you want to check it out, go to cosyndicate.io. We'll be doing some traveling in the next couple months. We're going to be in Ubud, Bali from now until January 3rd. Then we'll be in Bangkok, Chiang Mai, and Saigon sometime in January and February, and then possibly India in February and March. Message us if you want to meet up. It's always fun for us meeting our listeners. Last but not least, we want to thank our recent patrons, Ray and Jorn. Okay, let's get into the show.
Welcome to futurethinkers.org, a podcast about the evolution of technology, society, and consciousness. I'm Mike Gilliland.
And I'm Yuvia Ivanova.
To get notified of new podcasts and videos, go to futurethinkers.org and subscribe to our mailing list. You can also find us on iTunes, Stitcher, and YouTube.
If you like what we do and you want to help us make more podcasts and videos, give us a like or a review, share it with your friends, and consider becoming a patron. Go to patreon.com/futurethinkers. If you're looking to get serious about meditation, check out the meditation app that we've created with Vinay Gupta called The Cutting Machinery. Go to cuttingmachinery.org/app.
Last but not least, if you want to get access to more content, hidden episodes, or if you just want to chat with us and previous guests, then check out our community at community.futurethinkers.org. So why don't we just start over again? Just give us a brief introduction of yourself and what you're doing.
I work on a whole bunch of different kinds of projects, and I think that this is going to become increasingly the case. I have skill sets in things like strategy, ranging across the board: business strategy, military strategy, technology strategy, etc. I have skill sets in different kinds of science, in particular the edge of where science hits technology and where technology hits human society. So the way that technologies change cultural evolution. And I actually spent a good 15 years in the kind of the pragmatic world of building technology companies. So I also have expertise in pragmatics and where the rubber hits the road and where people can and can't do things. And so those skill sets then link up into kind of the roles that I play in different projects. But my essential rule is we're in a situation that is extremely challenging. It's for all the marbles. It's happening much more rapidly than we have any ability to really deal with. And so everybody has to be as fully deployed as they can be. And so, of course, eating my own dog food, I'm as fully deployed as I can be. And so I touch as many projects as are necessary and effective for me to be involved in, using and giving those skill sets to the degree which I can. I'm currently spending a substantial amount of time in the third wave of the blockchain, which is showing up as directly addressing the problems of decentralized governance, which we'll probably expand on. I'm spending a lot of time in meta-strategic formulations of what are the different paths of where the world is going to go and what are the risks that need to be taken into account and addressed in the immediate term, in the midterm, and in the long term, and in trying to work with people to formulate what are the viable paths that we can take. So think of that as at a kind of a very high theoretical level, but then what I bring is what's actually practically doable given the theoretical requirements. You could categorize that as something called deep code. And there's a whole group of people who are arranged around the deep code problems. Most recently, I just got pulled into a project of trying to figure out how to actually actualize the notion of wisdom in our emerging society, because a lot of the problems that we're dealing with are problems of a gigantic wisdom deficit that exists in our contemporary civilization, and learning how to actually take wisdom from being something that we gesture at to being something which is actually practically applied in our daily lives continuously is a project that I'm just getting involved in. I can go on forever, by the way. The list is probably several hundred.
Interesting. So if you look into the next 5 to 10 years, what do you think are some of the biggest problems that we're facing as a species on the planet?
Okay, so I'll actually categorize it in 3 distinct buckets. The first bucket is the fact that we're very powerful as a species and not disciplined or careful enough. And so the consequences of our actions can no longer be ignored. And so those consequences are coming back to get us. So we're going to be looking at all of the many, it's not 1 or 2, it's hundreds of thousands of distinct consequences of, say, for example, the amount of concentrated chemistry, hormones, and heavy metals that we introduce into our ecosystem, and the impact that has on the broader ecosystem, and the impact it has back on us. The impact that we have on our ontological environment by shifting the amount of time that we spend indoors versus outdoors, and the effect that it has on us. Obviously, the various effects we have on the constitution of our atmosphere, the impacts we have on the constitution of our oceans, the impacts we have on the constitution of our soil. Those are all one gigantic bucket. And the point is, we have too much power, we have too little wisdom, and that asymmetry is going to start in an accelerating fashion. It's biting us in the ass. Second has to do with our relationship to ourselves as humans. So again, for all of human history up until the 1940s, we could kind of get away with being dicks and being pretty poor at managing ourselves and each other, and that's no longer the case. That the whole set of human management techniques, so the forms of government and peacemaking that we have had, are inadequate to the challenge, and we're going to have to get extremely good, extremely quickly at actually resolving conflict, really truly deeply healing the underlying thing that causes the conflict, and getting every discrete human being into a position of what we call sovereignty, which I can talk about if you'd like. But basically learning how to relate to humanity. And then the third category is our relationship to our own tools and technologies. And of course, that third category impacts the first 2 as well. But whether this has to do with, say, for example, the notion of how we empower machines like Facebook to then come back and manipulate our limbic system, which then makes us incapable of actually behaving well in the world, or we empower things like, say, energy systems like nuclear reactors, which generate risks that we don't really understand how to contemplate, or continue on, fill in the blank. Phones that have dopamine jacking systems that decrease our capacity to be adaptive to the environment. All 3 of those are linked, but they're all 3 distinct. And the point is that their union, the connection between them, generates the total threshold that we have to get through. If we can't handle the total complexity of all 3 of those simultaneously, then it literally does lead to a collapse event.
So you talk a lot about sense making and how the complexity in the world is increasing faster than we can cope with it. How can we mitigate that? What can we do about it?
Okay, so this is actually an extremely hard question. So I'm going to go ahead and just throw it right down the middle. The way that we adapt to respond to our world actually goes through phases of punctuated equilibrium. And so at some point in the past, I don't know when, but let's call it at least 500 years ago and probably longer, probably even as late as the beginning of the Iron Age, human beings began to develop a neurocognitive psychological framework for responding to reality, a reality that changed at a certain pace. And I'm going to call this the paradigmatic mind. So the paradigmatic mind is a mind that creates a model of reality. It creates identities, it creates relationships, it creates heuristics, and it uses that to be able to have high-quality models for how to respond to reality under most circumstances. So your job as a developing human under the paradigmatic mind is to build a paradigm, learn how to run that paradigm, and then as you become an adult, run it. And when the world is changing at a slow enough pace, this works pretty well. You know how to farm. You have a bunch of rituals on how to relate to society and to the world. There's a bunch of basic social contracts that everybody implicitly accepts. And the socially constructed set of paradigms is adequate to the problems you're facing. And then what ends up happening is that on some periodic basis, maybe once or twice during your life or 2 or 3 times during a century, there might be a major paradigm shift where a big chunk of the paradigm system doesn't work. It collapses. It feels like a big social crisis. The society kind of recoheres around some new model, and then you glue that onto the paradigm and you move forward. And over the past 1,000 years or so, civilization is preceded by a process of building and modifying paradigms through this sort of crisis recoherence approach. And that's been an adaptive enough capacity to enable us to get where we are, which is pretty impressive. The problem is that when the pace of change is faster than the ability of our paradigm mind to adapt paradigms, you're going through paradigm collapses too frequently to ever cohere, and you actually end up in a situation of complete confusion. You literally can't make sense of your environment anymore because the thing that you use to make sense you can't trust it because you expect that it's going to be breaking or collapsing in unpredictable ways too often. And I would say that's actually a fair mapping of what's going on in the world right now. So many things are happening that appear to be surprises and this is because the environment is changing faster than the entire architecture of the paradigmatic mind can adapt to the environment. So what that means is we actually have to build an entirely different model of psychology, an entirely different model of modeling reality, and which is to say a new mind. Now, this new mind is going to have a very different relationship to other humans or other sentients, and a very different relationship to reality, which I think a lot of us, certainly a lot of the younger generations, I think intuitively get a sense for, because it's going to be an intrinsically collective intelligence. And by that I mean there won't be a strong sense of individuals having any degree of responsibility for really understanding the world. Like there won't be an idea that I as an individual really ever even try to believe that I understand the world very much. My responsibility is to maintain a really high quality sense of how clearly I am perceiving reality. So this has to do with this concept of sovereignty, which I'll explicate in a moment because I think it'll be important for this conversation. And then how effectively I can share that perspective with truth and clarity out into some kind of collective space, some shared space of insight. And then what will end up happening is that we will be constantly cohering groups of sentients. And by sentients, I mean both humans and increasingly capable machines, when and as if needed around particular problem domains, sharing our distinct perspectives, beginning to form an actual collective intelligence in that particular location, which collective intelligence is adequate to the scope of the real space, whatever it might be. And then once that is resolved, we'll then artifact that as effectively as possible, and then we'll decohere. So, the three of us might gather. We'll then figure out how to come into coherence by establishing various protocols for communication and understanding how each of us shares our perspective until we've got enough clarity that then we're really effectively have cohered into a collective intelligence. And then that thing has a certain capacity, which is vastly more than any of the three of us as individuals. But then what will happen is that we'll decohere. I'll go away. I'll go do something else. And getting extremely good at flowing between these coherences and decoherences, at orienting yourself towards the place where your energy and perspective is the most needful now, and entering into coherence quickly and fluidly with potentially extremely heterogeneous sentience is going to be the nature of what this new mind looks like. Yeah. So would you like me to go further on that or do more on sovereignty?
Yeah, I'd love to hear more on that, but I'd like to know if you have any examples of groups of people that are already succeeding in doing this.
Well, okay, so I'm going to give you a very pragmatic and prosaic example, and then we'll dive harder, because it actually happens all the time, pragmatically and prosaically, and then the challenge is how can you build a whole society on this principle? And the reason why I'm going to start there is because it gives us a little bit of hope, because it tells us that's a part of the basic human toolkit. So the good news is that human beings are obligate tribal, meaning that we're already evolved to think in groups. And in fact, my friend Brett Weinstein has proposed that we're only truly conscious in groups, that consciousness exists for the purposes of mediating groups. So when you take a very high quality musical band or a very high quality sports team or say a military like a SEAL team, these groups are operating in exactly this fashion. And it makes sense. Like you can't imagine a single individual often being able to create the thing that a whole musical band can create. It's just beyond their imaginal and active scope. So that's the simple example. And it's prosaic because most of us have experienced something like that, of entering into a communion and a flow with a group of people that is very collaborative and creative. So the real challenge is How do we scale that up, and how do we make it vastly more fluid? Because typically it might take years of deep collaboration to enter into that level of communion and flow. And obviously that doesn't scale. So now I'll move to a group that I know pretty well that is almost there. So this group is called the Santa Fe Institute. And they, to my knowledge, were the first group of people to be very, very aware of this kind of problem and trying to figure out how to address it. So back in the late 80s, it's a scientific group. So these are all very well-established scientists in very diverse domains. And they began to recognize that there was a need for some approach to science that was new or different to what they had all learned and mastered in the 20th century. So in the 20th century, we developed at the very finest level of perfection what you might call disciplinary science. So I'm a physicist, I'm a chemist, I'm a biologist, and within that, there's these increasingly refined disciplinary edges that I'm part of, and then there's a way that we can glue those disciplines back together. What the Santa Fe Institute discovered was the possibility for and the need for transdisciplinary science. And the word trans there is a very important suffix. It's not multidisciplinary, right? If I take a whole bunch of disciplines and glue them together and they try to collaborate, it's multidisciplinary. Transdisciplinary is actually trying to figure out how people who come from different worlds, different perspectives, different paradigms and models can get together, dispense with the totality of the artifacts of where they come from, and actually address reality directly in a fashion which is completely decoupled from the notions of discipline altogether. And so they named the problem and then began trying to explore it, starting in the late 80s. And they're not very good at it, but they're a heck of a lot better than most people. And it's yielded enormous positive results because it turns out there's just these gigantic problems that if you look at them from the point of view of a given discipline, like let's say you're in economics and physics can't see the problem, economics can't see the problem, even though the problem spans both economics and physics because the disciplines don't have the epistemological capacity to perceive it. But if you get an economist and a physicist together, they go through a process of deconstructing their disciplinary assumptions, still being able to hold the tools that they know how to use, but now they're holding the tools more lightly, and then go back all the way to base of responding simply to physical reality and querying reality with their tools, but now in a collaborative framework where each of them are bringing their point of view to bear and using the parallax of their diverse perspectives to begin highlighting something that exists in reality, but is in fact not obviously embodied in any given particular domain as we understand it. And so the Santa Fe Institute is an example of something that I might call like part of a transitionary framework where it's at scale. There's thousands of scientists who are roughly part of that community, and they've been for the past several decades trying to figure out how to do this sort of thing. But almost all of the people who are part of that are folks who were developed. They grew up in the 20th century, and so their minds are still very much paradigmatic minds. And even they're at the furthest edges of that, it's just very difficult to do this sort of thing, reverse engineering. I switch all the way to the other side, and I take a look at the youngest affected generation. I call them Generation Omega because I think they are, in fact, the last human generation, but many people might refer to them as Generation Z. So the kids who are born probably about 1999, 2000, and then up until recently. So they're going to be 18 years or so and younger. When I actually watch them, in particular when I watch them coordinate in something like Minecraft, I see the stuff that I observed at the Santa Fe Institute happening at a cognitive level, like deliberately. I see it actually happening intrinsically. So there's something about the way that Generation Omega has simply developed. The fact that they've sort of always lived in a world where it was possible and useful to communicate with the people you wanted to communicate with in real time. They're sort of always on, always connected.
Can you give a little bit more of an example of how they're communicating when they're playing that game?
Yeah, so my eldest daughter, who now is, she'll be 15 in a week. When she was in 6th grade, we agreed that she would work on a project of creating something in Minecraft. And so I was thinking very much in a 20th century idea. So I had the notion of a project plan and a series of phases where people would design and then they would create projects and then they would collaborate, that kind of thing, right? A very 20th century post-World War II operational management mindset. But I looked at her, I said, you're agreeing that you're going to create this kind of an object. Here's your design requirements. It's going to have this amount of stuff, and it's going to have at least 7 people contributing, and you're going to get it done by this date. And what I noticed was that within 48 hours, she had already brought 7 people into it. So first, the intuitive muscle of being able to reach out, communicate with, and cohere a group of people was the first. Like I don't think she even had to spend a moment thinking about it. She was just able to invoke a cohort of people who are willing to come together and play in this space almost instantly. And this was like a 3-month project. They had plenty of time to work on it. So for the better part of 3 months, they just played. They just did things, they collaborated, but they didn't have any structure, no sort of planning around what they were going to do. And as I was just watching this, I was very interested to see how this played out. My expectation was that worst case scenario would be sort of a learning experience, and we'd be able to debrief about what worked and what didn't work. So coming down to the last couple of weeks, I said, hey, you're almost to the end of your timeline here. It doesn't seem like you've actually created anything. Do you have a notion of how you're going to go do it? And she just looked at me for a moment and she said, oh, yeah. And so over a period of a week, she just sent out a signal to them, said, hey, can we do this? They all showed up. They had a conversation. And then, honestly, I'm in this point where I can't actually tell you what happened because it's outside of my lived experience. I was just watching something that I don't actually get, but I can tell you what happened. An absolutely astounding level of creativity. And this process where, I'm talking about a 6th grade kid, she's sitting at her computer. She has like 7 windows open simultaneously. She's typing in all the different windows. She actually has voice commands. She's talking to different people. And for about 4 hours straight, 4 or 5 days in a row, this was going on. And I was actually watching gigantic structures emerging, people being given or taking responsibility for different kinds of things. Like one person took responsibility for doing programming and creating various kinds of activities in the blocks that could do stuff. Somebody else began just kind of holding and outlining the framework of what the space would look like. Somebody else just decided they were going to be doing narrative and telling a story. And they had some capacity to simultaneously allow every individual to take a particular piece and run with it while maintaining the coherence of the whole, but without any notion of like a top-down leader or any notion of everybody getting together and sort of deliberating on it in consensus. And yet it happened. And so at the end of the period, they created something that was absolutely astounding. I mean, it was physically gorgeous. There's layers and layers of richness. There was multimodal, like it wasn't just architectural. There was also really interesting interactivity. There was storytelling. There was actually different agents, played different pieces in it. And so, when I look at the end, it's not clear to me that I could have figured out anyway. And, I'm somebody who's built complex stuff. I don't know that I could have built anything equivalent to that in the level of the richness and the modality, given a team of extremely competent senior design resources and that amount of time. And they did it all intuitively. So that's another example, right? So you've got like these 3 pieces where you've got folks who are older, beginning to grasp the necessity of operating in this transmedia, transdisciplinary environment and beginning to experiment with what that looks like and how to do it. And then you've got the folks that are younger who, for a variety of different reasons, adaptively have a lot of these skill sets. And we can go into great detail of why that's the case. Like, what does it mean to grow up in an environment, in the post-Wikipedia environment, where the idea of disciplinary expertise and canonical knowledge just doesn't exist at all. And everything is a collaboratively co-created fluid object that everybody has some degree of skepticism about, and everybody has some degree of ownership and the possibility of shaping. Like the epistemological consequences of being on the other side of that transition are part of what I'm talking about.
That is so interesting hearing about how
that's fascinating. It sounds like some sort of swarm intelligence.
Interestingly enough, Daniel and I and one of our collaborators, Forrest, have determined that we should be very careful about using the word swarm as the metaphor, because even though it's an easy metaphor and it kind of feels right, it turns out it's actually wrong in a very specific set of ways, and we don't want to get people locked into the wrong frameworks. It's actually something that has not yet existed on the surface of the earth, although metaphorically it is similar to the way that swarming behavior operates. It actually is operating in a transcendental modality, which means that it's doing something categorically different than any kind of existing swarm intelligence has ever evolved to do.
So it's different from stigmergy.
All right, you ready? This is going to be a tough one. Let me see if I can do this right. This is a really, really hard concept, but if we can do it, it's extremely powerful. Okay, so are you guys at all familiar with the emergence of calculus in Western civilization?
Not quite.
Nope.
I think I might be able to do it quickly enough that it's useful. The key insight is that these two extraordinary geniuses, Isaac Newton and Gottfried Leibniz, both developed calculus almost at the same time. They're both alive at the same time. They're both working on similar problems, and so they both recognize the necessity of solving the problem. But the approach they took were very, very different. Newton's approach to calculus and Leibniz's approach to calculus, if you weren't intimately familiar, they would seem very different. And so what we might say is that there's an abstraction called calculus, and there's instantiations of calculus, the Newtonian version and the Leibnizian version, which are both instantiations of the abstraction. The abstraction lives in a realm of pure abstraction, meaning I could come up with an instantiation of calculus, and as long as it was actually an authentic instantiation of calculus, it would be compatible with what Newton and Leibniz did, but it might be very different. And so this concept of an absolute abstraction, something that is non-mediated, but nonetheless is real, and then the ability to instantiate that in some medium, in Leibniz's case, instantiated it in the format that he did, in Newton's case, instantiated in the format that he did, that's a very deep fundamental concept, the ability to recognize that there are objects in reality that are pre-mediated, trans-mediated, but real, and then there's a mechanism by which human beings, by hypothesis any sentient, can perceive those abstractions and then allow them to be mediated into some kind of actuality.
It's almost like you're describing multidimensional objects that we're somehow tapping into.
Yeah, that is actually true, because there's certain kinds of, if I describe something like a hypercube, which is just a cube in higher dimensions, the beauty of that is that I can say the phrase hypercube and you can't really conceive of it because we don't really have mechanisms for perceiving or conceiving of things in, say, a 10-dimensional hypercube. I can say the words, and if you understand math right, you can do things with it, but the beauty of it is you can't pretend that you actually are thinking about it. Whereas if I say something like the generator function from which stigma G emerges, you might think you know what that is. But the key is as long as you hold it like you would hold a 10-dimensional hypercube, then you're in the right space. So now what I can say is there's a generator function. There's some transmedia object from which stigma G, which is to say the mechanism by which swarms coordinate themselves, emerges. And the thing that I'm talking about, the thing that is now emergent in the contemporary environment, the thing that these kids were doing, is coming from the same generator function, but it's not the same as stigma G, because it's obviously dealing with a mediation layer, i.e. human beings and human technology, which is vastly, vastly different than what's available to bees and termites. Does that make any sense?
Totally.
Yes, absolutely.
Awesome. That is fabulous that happened. Now it's time we were talking about sovereignty. You ready?
Right.
Yeah.
Now, already I'm going to have to make sure we have a caveat because the word sovereignty has all kinds of weird loading. And if people are listening to this and they feel like they think they know what that means, I apologize in advance because in some sense we're trying to just redefine it, but it's the closest word that we have to the thing we're trying to describe. So in an individual agent, a sentient agent's relationship to the world, there are three distinct functions. We can actually map it to four if we want, but I'm going to map it to three. Three distinct functions that describe the capacity of a sentient agent's ability to respond to the world. The first piece is the degree to which that sentient agent is able to perceive reality. And so you might call that the perceptive modality. And so perception here includes everything from, say, like your senses, your ability to see. If I lack eyesight, I can't perceive electromagnetic radiation. If I lack olfaction, I can't perceive chemical molecules, right? If I lack hearing, I can't perceive sound waves. So the modality, and then also the bandwidth. So for example, if I have vision, but I can't perceive ultraviolet, I can't perceive ultraviolet. And similarly, if I have vision, but I'm looking at the sun, I'll be overwhelmed. I'll have too much input to be able to process it. So the first portion of sovereignty is the total capacity to perceive reality. The second portion combines sense-making and choice-making, which is we might call meaning, your capacity to take perception and move that through into making good choices about what to do in the world. So if I'm like a camera and I can see in the sense that light can come in and it can be converted into something, but if there's nothing else, I'm just a camera, there's no sense-making, there's no meaning-making happening at all. And the degree to which I have the capacity to make meaning is in many ways the degree to which I have the potential to have agency. And there's lots of variables there. Again, there's questions of overwhelm. Like, for example, let's say I'm in a situation where somebody's coming at me physically with a large threat of violence. I'm perceiving it, but now I'm trying to make meaning out of it, which is to say, what do I do? How do I respond to this? If I get fight or flight, if my adrenal system kicks off and it actually kicks me into overwhelm, then I'm actually decreasing my capacity to make good choices because the fight or flight response shifts me into a very narrow band of action. Or maybe I just have bad heuristics. There's just, I'm perceiving some pattern in the world, but I don't know how to make sense of that pattern. So the signal is out there, but I just can't do anything with it. And then the third dimension is your capacity to actually make effective action in the world. So perhaps I have perceived the pattern. I see that carbon dioxide and methane in the atmosphere is generating feedback loops that are raising the amount of temperature and the acidification of the oceans, and I perceive that that's going to lead to catastrophic collapse of coral reefs. But I don't have any capacity to respond to it in terms of agency. The problem is just too complex, my effective action is too limited, or my ability, my power is too limited, or my ability to understand the consequences of my actions is too limited. The rate limiting on action has to do with the scope of the problem in relationship to your power, bang for the buck, which is to say the amount of energy that it takes for you to deliver on some degree of effectiveness, and unintended consequences, the degree to which what you're doing generates more change in the world than you're intending. So if I think about like a pond, I think many of us have run into the situation as a kid. There's like a very, very smooth pond, and I can see through it. It's perfectly clear, and I want to grab something at the bottom of the pond, but as I put my fingers into the water, it creates ripples. It makes it impossible for me to see. So because I'm interfering with my own environment, my agency is preventing my ability to be effective. So that's consequences, my inability to relate to the world in a way to actually respond to the consequences of my own actions. So every discrete sentient agent is going to have an envelope that takes all three of these aspects into consideration, and we'll call that envelope sovereignty. And so the more sovereign you are, it's like a sphere, the more capacity you have to perceive, make meaning in, and respond to the reality that you're living in. And a failure in any one of these three modalities will tend to disrupt your sovereignty or limit it in your environment. And so what ends up happening is this thing that we're talking about, this new frame of mind, this new kind of collective intelligence, is extremely sensitive to the actual sovereignty of the individual agents that compose it. So then, using this concept of sovereignty, imagine right now the three of us are attempting to enter into a form of communion, meaning we're trying to form a collective intelligence. And that collective intelligence is going to be bound by the sovereignty of each one of us. Meaning, for example, if the two of you have a private language, which you probably do, right? You're in deep relationship, you're aware of each other's facial expressions, body language, tone of voice. So there's a lot of things that are going to be happening at the level of perception that I might not be able to perceive. So you'll have a sense of what's happening that I won't have any access to because it's outside of the sphere of my sovereignty. But let's say, for example, I've done a lot of work and practice, and so I have a high degree of discernment around those kinds of things. I could just watch and listen. Even though I won't quite be able to make sense of it, I'll be able to build a vastly better sense of it than if I was a lower level of discernment. But let's flip it around. Let's say, for example, that we're engaging in something, and I say something that triggers you emotionally, meaning that there's something that happens in the verbal domain, that a series of sounds that come out of my mouth, you hear and process, that simultaneously the way that you process things generates a response in your body, which is highly emotional, and that emotional response actually pushes you to the point where you've got an adrenal response and a cortisol response, which then reduces your sovereignty. Right? So now we've got two issues. One issue is the level of sovereignty that you had initially wasn't adequate to the expression that I made, meaning that it pushed you out of sovereignty. And now secondarily, your sovereignty is reduced by the state that you're in. So then what ends up happening is Evie and I would then ideally have a perception to recognize that happened, have a set of heuristics and actions to be able to hold, and either help you process through that and get you back into sovereignty so our communion has integrity, or recognize that that's just not going to happen. And so we would just sort of step back and wait until it can kind of come back into integrity as a group. And that's it. Like, that's how it's going to work, is each discrete individual has to go through a process of really deep work on their own individual capacity to show up in every dimension, cognitively, emotionally, perceptually, and exploring possible modalities of reality that our conventional models of reality we don't have really good names for, or we don't even think exist because we don't know. And then secondarily, learning then how to use that individual capacity to increasingly come into faster, deeper, and more coherent communion in groups. And I should mention, by the way, that in the practices that we've done so far, every geometry is qualitatively different. So dyads are different than triads, and triads are different than fours, etc.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Very interesting. I wanted to rewind a little bit to what you said at the beginning. Can you talk a bit more about the global collapse that we're going through right now and the war that you mentioned earlier?
Sure. So let me put it into a framework first, and then talk about the pragmatics. So the framework looks like this. I think everybody alive who has any degree of self-awareness notices that sometimes they're at the top of their game and sometimes they're not. If you've been driving all night, you had a bad choice for dinner, you haven't slept, you drink too much coffee, your likelihood of doing things that you don't think are wise later is much higher than if you're well-resourced, right? So, of course, that fact, that sort of metaphor is happening broadly all over the world. Every minute of every day and everybody's interactions with each other and with the world is increasingly pushing us into states where we're making worse and worse choices. For example, I have recently fully unplugged from social media because social media is almost completely toxic, which is to say that when I go into any social media environment, I find myself decreasingly capable of making good choices and increasingly willing to make bad choices because it has that effect.
Wow.
Now, this is an interesting problem because we've got billions of people who are now connected on social media. And by the way, I don't just mean social media. Think also broadcast media. If I read an article in the New York Times, there's a 99% chance that I'm worse off rather than better off. Books, particularly old books, by the way, are things that we can still rely on because they take so long to write and to read. They have this cool concept called, what's the word? Slipped my mind. But the term has to do with a differential time element. So books are slower than other things. And so they'll actually present a different framework for sense making than things that happen in real time. So by the way, that's a good mechanism. If you're feeling really, really demoralized, unplug from real time information and plug into a great book from, say, the 19th century. And that'll actually help you build back up capacity. All right, so that's one. So what's happening is the mechanism by which we collaborate right now, the tools and techniques by which our information flows, our sense-making frameworks are really fucked up. And they're making us emotionally less capable of responding to reality. And they're actually breaking down our cognitive capacity as well. Like, you just look at the choice making and decision making that's happening. You guys are not in the US, so I don't know what's going on and where you are. But I can tell you, the United States is in the process of going insane in every direction. I mean insane almost like in a technical term, meaning increasingly incapable of actually perceiving or responding to reality and dropping into lower and lower levels of pragmatic sovereignty. And just like in a family where everybody's getting tired and cranky, people start itching for a fight. And when somebody starts pushing because they're just itching for a fight, that just pushes other people. And so we're kind of eating the seed corn of civility. Now, that's one side. Other side, reality is getting harder to deal with. The global financial system is now a full decade into a completely delusional, false sense of stability, where every single piece of it is becoming more and more fragile across the board. Ecosystems we're now deeply into the environment where climate change and the consequences thereof are actually having pragmatic effects. Decreasing crop yields, decreasing freshwater reserves at the edges. It's not yet so obviously catastrophic that everybody's aware of it, but if you actually see where the sensitive locations are, say like Syria last year, you can see the absolute immediate consequences of those effects, and then that has a cascade effect, tapping into the fact that all the most fragile nation states, the ones that have the highest degree of fragility and tension and lowest reserves, are now beginning to fail and externalizing their own instability into the environment around them, which creates increasing tension on the other environments. So, for example, the flow of refugees out of Syria are now impacting, say, France and Italy, which are themselves already going through like 3 different levels of challenge: economic, demographic, their own internal cultural dissonance, the impact of social media and technology on underlying frameworks. Like, all these different variables are playing back on each other. And so net, what we have is basically 2 distinct forces that are happening simultaneously. On the one hand, our individual and collective capacities to make good choices in the world are decreasing because the tools that we have are actually pushing us in a negative direction. And on the other hand, the stuff we have to deal with is getting more and more present and more urgent and more intense. So this is going to lead us into a situation where we're going to make extremely bad choices because we're using bad heuristics. I'll give you a concrete example. And by the way, this is not just a purely theoretical example. The United States right now is in a classic scenario where good strategies from the past 1,000 years would say that we're facing a choice between significant civil unrest, which in principle could very easily transition into some kind of civil war, although we don't know exactly what that would look like. Things don't ever look the same over and over again, but very significant civil unrest, which traditionally the Machiavellian response to that is pick some sort of other outside of adequate threat, pick a fight with them so as to generate coherence internally. All right, we're all familiar with that basic approach, right?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
So if I'm sitting in charge of maintaining the integrity of the United States and I watch it begin to fall apart into civil unrest and increasingly accelerating towards something which smacks a lot like civil war, I might choose to say, okay, I'm going to pick a fight with somebody of adequate threat. And I don't think North Korea is enough. That would cause the people inside to say, oh boy, this is a real shit. That we have to put our differences to the side and rally around the flag so as to protect ourselves from the external threat. Or at least give me the ability to impose the level of internal discipline, sometimes known as martial law, to just quash civil dissent internally. Now that playbook has been played for thousands of years. I'm not making that up, and it's not magic. Like lots and lots of people understand that both intuitively and consciously. So one, the fact that tells us that it's likely to occur. Two, I happen to know that those conversations are being had. But then three, and here's the sneaky part, that playbook is no longer valid. The set of tools that worked, even all the way up into the late 20th century, no longer apply in our contemporary environment. So this loops us all the way back to the failure of sense-making. If I'm a strategic decision maker at the level of nation states, I've got a sense-making model that includes the techniques that I just mentioned that unfortunately are obsolete, but I don't know they're obsolete, which means that I'm going to be making choices based upon an obsolete set of models without knowing that they're obsolete, which means I'm making increasingly bad choices and maybe becoming increasingly confused as to why they're bad choices, which means then I have a choice. Either I double down, I commit myself to my sense-making model and assume that my confusion is bad signal, or I accept the fact that I don't know what's going on and start double-checking on my sense-making model. Now, what do human beings tend to do in that scenario?
Assume the world is crazy and they're sane.
They're right, yeah.
That is correct. That's not a bad choice. Like from an evolutionary perspective, the phrase always wrong or often wrong but never in doubt is actually a good strategy, except for when it's not. And now is when it's not.
All right, that's it for this episode. To get the show notes, books, mentions, go to futurethinkers.org/47. And part 2 of this episode will be available at futurethinkers.org/48 once it's live. And if you want to try Qualia, go to futurethinkers.org/brainhack and use the code FUTURE to get 10% off your purchase. All right, we'll talk to you in the next episode.
Thanks for listening to the Future Thinkers podcast. To get notified of new podcasts and videos, go to futurethinkers.org and subscribe to our mailing list. You can also find us on iTunes, Stitcher, and YouTube.
If you like what we do and you want to help us make more podcasts and videos, give us a like or a review, share it with your friends, and consider becoming a patron. Go to patreon.com/futurethinkers. If you're looking to get serious about meditation, check out the meditation app that we've created with Vinay Gupta called The Cutting Machinery. Go to cuttingmachinery.org/app.
Last but not least, if you want to get access to more content, hidden episodes, or if you just want to chat with us and previous guests, then check out our community at community.futurethinkers.org.